Hey guys, Mr. Happy here, and welcome to Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn 101. This is a special episode. I actually have with me here ZiggyD. I've done a few podcasts with him before, so you guys might remember him, and we're going to be talking a little bit about this controversy that's going on about pay to play versus free to play, the subscription based model. Now, this is a hot topic of Final Fantasy XIV because after 2 years, 3 years of failure, essentially, it's a lot of people are considering it a bit of a stretch to continue with this model. So, Ziggy, before we go on, how about you tell everyone what your kind of experiences are in gaming with pay to play, free to play, MMOs, any game in particular with either of these models in place?
Yeah, definitely. G'day, mate. That's a good starting point as well because I started out when I first started getting into MMOs with thinking that I would never really be interested in playing a subscription-based game. So that's an interesting starting point now, considering that I'm starting to play Final Fantasy XIV and I'm definitely considering paying for that subscription. But in terms of MMOs comparing now for different payment models, I think we've got three things that we're looking at. And that I'm looking at, especially when comparing and thinking about whether Final Fantasy XIV will be worth it. First one is your pure subscription-based model, which is Final Fantasy XIV. And then you've got Neverwinter, which is another game I've played recently, and it's completely free to pay. Free to pay. You are free to pay as well. And then there's, on top of that, there's Guild Wars 2, which I also played quite a bit as well. And it's that pay once, free to play after that. So I consider that a different subscription model because it actually has different implications as well.
Yeah. So those are the three games that we'll definitely refer to the most. I myself have been pretty much a pay guy. Yeah, I know, right? That's going to get made fun of in the comments. I've always, because I played Final Fantasy XI for 7 years. I played WoW for about a year and a half. I played Final Fantasy XIV, regrettably, on and off for 2 years when it was in its initial state. But I mean, I have tasted some of the other types of games out there. I have played games such as Neverwinter very briefly. I have played Guild Wars 2. I played that for several months. Played Rift. I pretty much played anything that's out there. Star Wars, everything, DCU. It's endless. I'm just an MMO guy. What can I say? And there's just so many different types of models out there. But the big thing that I think when people think of free-to-play games is a cash shop. And now I know you play Path of Exile. Does Path of Exile have a cash shop? Because I'm not too familiar with that kind of implementation.
Yeah, I thought about bringing Path of Exile into this discussion originally and comparing it in terms of being a free-to-play game, but I honestly don't think that's a fair comparison at all because it's a completely different model and completely different game. The way that Path of Exile does it is, I think, the perfect way to do free-to-play, and I'm completely in love with it. It's purely cosmetic. The only thing actually in-game that you can pay for is stash space, and it's kind of like an arbitrary convenience thing. But other than that, you can't buy any items. There's no possible way to convert, some arbitrary currency to another currency to gold to buy stuff in game like you can in a lot of these other free-to-play games. So I don't think it's a fair comparison, really. I don't think it's worth comparing in terms of MMOs. But if an MMO could do something like that, I would be very happy with that. But so far, it hasn't been done. Not to my knowledge, at least.
Exactly, and that's kind of the reason I kind of was hoping for an answer like that. Since Path of Exile isn't an MMO, I was really wondering how they would handle it, and I was wondering if that kind of transition could be brought into an MMO, because when you look at games that, even if they were once pay to play or are now free to play, any free to play game basically needs to have some sort of income, and it's always in a cash shop. And usually get things like experience boosts there, gold boosts. I know Rift has some sort of system where the more you pay, the more rewards you get. There just seems to be too much emphasis on the cash shop, and that's really my big gripe in the MMO world with the free to play model. Obviously, people are free to do with their money whatever they want, but personally, I feel like that model is sort of shows the greed that companies have and that they just need a quick buck. What do you feel about that?
Yeah, that's definitely the biggest thing for me that I'm feeling with Final Fantasy XIV coming into it and feeling that there's none of that coercive monetization, because that's what it is. There's different levels of this coercive monetization going on where the game is designed in a way to, at all possible all possible points during your play of the game, is to encourage you to spend money. It makes sense. Like, they need to make money with their game. So, but when you have a subscription-based game, their coercive monetization in that game is just to encourage you to keep playing every month. Like, the only way that they're encouraging you to keep spending money is to make sure that you want to play that game in a month's time. And I think the best way to do that is through designing the game well. However, when you come to a free-to-play game, it's not enough to just design a good game. Like, it can be a good game, and that's definitely an important factor. Like, I think Neverwinter, for example, was a fantastic game, but they also have to, on top of that, layer in this, how can we encourage people to spend more money? We can have this PvP system, and then we can say you can do a bit better in PvP if you pay a lot of money to combine these runes, and then you have these effects that you can use to best your opponents. And just every step of the game feels like it's trying to encourage you to pay something, and it just feels dirty.
Yeah, and it's actually something that I brought up in a previous review of Ragnarok Online 2, and it's the term pay to win. Now, it gets thrown out there a lot, especially even if we're going to go back into Path of Exile, since it's sort of a rival of Diablo 3. Diablo 3 was considered a pay to win game. It's just the sort of model where paying gives you an advantage over another player. And you've already done your thoughts about it, and I pretty much just agree that the model there are just certain aspects about it, like Neverwinter, where just the whole idea of having to pay to get ahead of other players is just not attractive to most people. It's obviously attractive to some because those games exist, but do you feel that games would benefit more business-wise from a pay-to-win model versus a subscription model?
Yeah, that's the real question at the moment, isn't it? Especially where we're at the moment. We're right on the verge of the majority of people seem to be feeling that subscription is a bad idea and it's not viable. That to say, how can you have any other subscription game that isn't World of Warcraft? Like, that doesn't make any sense. I don't know why I've gone really dark all of a sudden, but
It's all
yeah,
right.
I honestly cannot answer that question yet. I feel like a free-to-play game that's set up in a way that doesn't have that coercive monetization in terms of pay-to-win elements, I feel like that's probably the best way to go. But even then, it can still feel a bit dodgy. Like, I think Path of Exile will be viable long-term, but I don't know how that can be applied to MMOs. I think something valuable that we could do would be to talk about the three different options players have, because there's people now that are looking at Final Fantasy XIV and saying, that looks like a really good game, but I'm not sure whether I want to be able to pay a subscription to that. There's other games I can try. So why don't we then take, both of us have experienced Guild Wars, Neverwinter, and Final Fantasy XIV, so we should be able to compare each of those. And they represent three distinct options, not just in terms of the games people could play, but a style of monetization people could play. So we'll start with Neverwinter, if I may.
Sure. Would you like me to start this one?
No, that's all right. All right, I'll kick things off. Neverwinter is a pure free-to-play game. There's a lot you can experience in the game. It's also a really good game too. I recommend checking it out at least. It has a really good core game system. It's completely free to play. You can play the entire thing and pretty much experience all of the content without paying any money. And that, I think, still offers a lot of value to people. However, on the other hand, because it is purely free to play, they're not making any money unless they encourage you to spend money. There is that coercive monetization. Now, because it is a purely free to play game, there's also another thing on top of that, which is this thing called pay gating, essentially, where if you want to reach this higher level or reach this extra effectiveness, then you have to pay that money. And that's what I was talking about with like PvP runes and buying extra bags and buying faster mounts for PvP was a huge one. There's just a lot of these gates that you have to pay to be able to cross. So that's the first one. How did you feel when you played Neverwinter briefly as well, didn't you?
Yeah, I was so disappointed to see the pay gating towards the end of the game, because I remember seeing to compare certain runes it would cost you hundreds of dollars. I mean, you could of course play the market if that was your forte, but if you weren't really good at that, then you had to count on pretty much digging into your wallets in order to get anywhere. And while that kind of game may entertain you for a month, 2 months time, and for no money at all, that's perfectly okay. After the 2 months, if you're not willing to do the pay gating thing, I feel like it's just such an abrupt halt to your gaming experience. And that's kind of where MMO hoppers have come into play in recent times, is just playing free to play games and hopping to the next one. And a lot of that's because of pay gating. So I'm assuming that they're just hoping there will be a small portion of people that will pay often enough to warrant the game to stay alive. And it seems Neverwinter's doing fine with that. So it's not my personal way I prefer to play my games, but it is a way out there, and I do respect the people who prefer those type of games at the very least.
Yeah, it's certainly viable, and it's certainly the right game for a bunch of people. I don't think my argument is ever going to be that one style of thing is better in
Absolutely
general than
not.
another style of game. But
Yeah.
yeah, hopefully we can at least help people figure out. I want to come back to that topic of MMO hoppers as well, people jumping around to different MMOs. But we'll move on to Guild Wars 2, which represents a fairly new sort of model where you buy the game once and then it's free to play after that. But because it's free to play after that, they have a microtransaction system in there. Now, Guild Wars 2 didn't at any point have any sort of pay gating in it. I played through to max level and delved into endgame content. My girlfriend still plays the game today and plays it a lot and plays a lot of endgame content. And there's nothing you can do to pay money really to give you a major advantage in that. Nothing that can give you, bring you above other people. However, they still have that coercive monetization. I still felt like the game was encouraging me in all possible opportunities to pay money, for the cosmetic stuff they had going, or to, And then there's the other thing then where I guess this is probably the biggest issue of having any of this sort of system, is they have this, you can spend money to buy a currency in the game, which you can convert to another currency to buy stuff in game, and that I guess is kind of a pay to win element, but I don't think it really makes sense in Guild Wars 2. But yeah, that's the most awkward feeling one for me. How do you feel about that?
I feel Guild Wars 2 is the closest we'll ever come to the perfect system for an MMO. At least the system that absolutely everybody can accept. Now, their buy to play is great because it's a one-time fee. You're guaranteed you will never absolutely have to pay another dime, which in the times that we have now is just such a comforting feeling for MMO players. They love the feeling of having a game they can play in the long term and put a one-time fee down for it. Now, but then again, you do say there is a problem on some levels with the microtransactions, and they've tried to level it out a little bit by making it so you could also use in-game currency to get the cash shop currency, and that sort of leveled it out. It gives again another feeling of comfort, but I feel that just the fact that you can get gold with the microtransaction currency is a big problem. Now, mostly you can't buy things that are that much greater. Obviously you can buy gear that is greater than the stuff that you're getting from the dungeons right off the bat. Yeah, but at the max level, which is really where most of this pay gating comes to place, is at max level once you've experienced all the content up to the max level. It's not really a big deal. I remember the one thing Guild Wars 2 had has always been cosmetics. Guild Wars 1 was very much about cosmetics as well. And even the highest tier of weapon, which I believe is a legendary, it's still called in Guild Wars 2, that is more for cosmetics than it is for stats. And even though you can technically buy better weapons, I like that the best weapons aren't that much better than everything else. So even the people who do go out and spend, they are technically paying for an advantage, so they kind of fall into pay to win, but at the same time it's not so deep of an advantage that it determines that you are going to absolutely dominate over somebody else. And I think that's the closest we're ever going to get to a system everyone can be happy with, because just cosmetics in an MMO
I guess
yeah.
I guess the core of that system then is that you have to have that initial outlay. People. It is a very comfortable system, I think, for a lot of people, as you said. But you have that initial outlay, but then in the future, you know that there's opportunities where you could spend money if you don't want to grind for that cosmetic stuff, if that stuff is important to you. So there's always that there. So that's important, that point that you can pay more in the future, and that you probably will end up paying more if you're really invested in the game. And then we compare that to a subscription-based model like Final Fantasy XIV, where the game it has that subscription model. The developers know where their money's coming from. They don't have to design the game in any other way than to keep you interested in playing long term, so that you'll come back month after month after month. Now, with that system, you don't ever have that coercive monetization, as I said, and once you're actually in that, and once you've already paid that subscription, it feels very comfortable. Now, a bit of a counter argument a lot of people throw around is that they feel like they're forced to play once they've paid that subscription. How do you feel about that, like as a fairly rampant subscription player yourself?
I feel it's a completely valid argument. I mean, we pay for services all the time in real life. I wouldn't pay for a phone if I wasn't going to use it all the time. Why would I pay for a game if I wasn't going to play it all the time? It's an extremely fair observation, and I completely respect it. However, I tend to use this as a counter argument to that. A lot of people who play MMOs like myself, we are obviously spending $15 a month. Now, I know that sort of makes us feel like we have to play, But my counter argument is that most of the time it ends up saving me money, because if I don't have a game to play, if I'm just maybe hopping around between single player games on a console or something along those lines, maybe a bunch of games on Steam, I'll tend to buy a game, beat it in a few days, since I'm playing so much as it is because of my MMO mentalities, and I'll end up beating it, and I'm like, okay, well now I need another game, so I'll buy another one, and I'll buy another one. So that doesn't apply to necessarily everybody, but it is my counter argument to the whole I feel forced to play. Most gamers are playing enough a day to sort of warrant paying for that kind of service, and that's really what it is, because they're focusing on content. It is I do consider it a service, sort of, if that makes any sense.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense too, because I think the whole subscription model, as we're saying, you know, there's these 3 different types of game, and they're going to appeal to 3 different types of people. The subscription model, I think, is going to be the game that the type that appeals to the people that are going to and do want to play quite a lot. You know, they're always going to get the most value out of that. Now, people who have, you know, more, you know, like 60-hour-a-week jobs and have families and stuff and don't have much time to play, they can play like a week or two, an hour or two every week, then they're going to probably get the most value out of those free-to-play games, because they don't have any commitment to pay, and then they can pay because they, you know, they probably have an excess of money. Then they, you know, they don't feel too bad about throwing some dollars into that. So, you know, sending these different people to the different systems. However, I'm noticing that one of the biggest arguments against subscription-based models is coming from the group of people that are those MMO hoppers that you mentioned earlier. The people that play an MMO for 1 or 2 months when it first releases, and then are straight away looking for the next MMO to play. You know, they're not really interested in sticking around for very long. It's mostly these people I'm seeing that are, to me, at least on my videos and my comments and that, or on forums and things, are saying that the subscription model is bad for them. You know, that it forces them to play, and that it's a waste of money for them. You know, they don't want to have to pay a subscription every month. But if their plan is to try that game for a month or two and then to go to a new MMO, then they're not out any further. They can cancel their subscription after that point. That argument just doesn't make any sense to me. Like, let's look at Final Fantasy 14, for example. You pay the initial purchase price, which is slightly more than 1 month's subscription for most people. I got it for around $22, which the subscription is about $13. So it's a little bit more, a bit more than 1 month. And after that, say you want to play the game for 3 months before going to another MMO, then you're paying 3 months worth of subscription and a little bit more for the initial purchase. And you get your 3 months value out of it, and that's all you pay, and you don't have to pay any more. I don't understand that argument.
Yeah,
hopefully that causes people to reflect. What do you think?
I've absolutely never even thought of it that way. I know a lot of my ideals are very similar, but I've never thought of it, because I've always just said, yeah, I understand what those people mean. But when you put it like that, now it's like, now I'm kind of doubting when I've always, yeah, I understand it, because now I don't think I understand that. You just flipped my mind up right there. And it's very interesting, because I read an interview with Yoshi-P himself, and he actually explains what the point of a subscription model is. And a lot of people are also saying that the subscription model is bad because all these other subscription-based games are going free to play. Like, it's like they're saying it's an obvious sign that the subscription model is dying, that it needs to go, and that Final Fantasy can't do this. But he makes some very excellent points that I, as someone who's played MMOs for the past decade, have never once considered. And his big point was that a lot of these games, Star Wars, Rift, I'm sure there's more that I just can't think of, because those are the 2 big honchos that have kind of switched over. DC Universe, I think, used to be pay to play also. Lord of the Rings, some of those. He says that most of those games have investors, and investors put the money forward for the development team, and they expect it to get paid back. So when the subscriptions don't necessarily match the expectations, they panic. They have to choose between firing a bunch of people or paying back their investors really quickly. So they plan to switch to a free-to-play model to gain a quick buck to give back to their investors, and then from that point on, they develop the game around that. He says the big difference between Square Enix and Blizzard and the rest of these companies is that they are using their own money to develop the game. So they don't need 9 million subscribers like these games are expecting to completely overtake WoW. I remember all of the Rift ads saying, stop being an Azeroth, come play Rift, and things like that. And it's just like they were trying to not only bank off of WoW's success, but bank off of people getting bored of WoW. And they didn't really have the subscriber base that they expected, and they went into a panic. And Square Enix used the number 400,000 subscribers as a steady amount that they would consider okay to have. And that's a lot lower than World of Warcraft. But it just goes to show you how the investors being a factor is just, I never thought of that as a factor in why games go free to play, and it was just such an eye opener for
Yeah,
me.
that's
What do you
really
think
interesting.
about that?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've never really thought about it from the investor point of view either, and that actually explains a lot. When you compare the larger companies like Square Enix and Blizzard, and especially because they are happy to even potentially not make a ton of money on that game because it furthers their brand as a whole. Like, for example, with even I think if WoW wasn't still making a lot of money on its subscriptions, they'd probably keep that around just with its subscription model just because it's that important keystone for the brand, I guess. But yeah, they're more comfortable to not make that money since it is their own money that they're investing. That's an interesting point.
Yeah. Also, another big thing about subscriptions that I've noticed is it's always the promise of content. And Yoshi specifically spoke about Star Wars in this respect. Star Wars was blown up to be this like game that was going to be great in all aspects, but they kind of fell short in the terms of content. And when you have a subscription-based model, you're kind of promising them that content's going to come out regularly. And I think that is really a big determining factor of how, because obviously, like you said, you need to keep people coming back every month. So you need to be releasing content steadily enough. And if these other games aren't able to
Yep.
do that, well, then you can't keep a subscription. In Final Fantasy 14, he's been saying every 2.5 months there's going to be a content patch. Now, we won't see if he keeps that promise until October, but on those hopes, that seems like just enough time to complete the content for the first time, at least for hardcore players, farm it and get some gear, and then the new content's already out. It seems like it seems like he's thought of everything when it comes to the subscription model. Having heard that, what do you think about 2.5 months new content every 2.5 months?
Yeah, that feels really solid. There's the counter argument, that games like Guild Wars 2 are doing that to encourage people to stay with the microtransactions and to keep investing in the game in that sense. So it kind of works the same. So I'm not really sure about how you can compare those two things, but definitely there's something to be said for like the long-term scheduled content, like as shown by games like WoW, where they have had that large subscription base for a long time and they've continued to push content out for those people. And as we've both said, you need to encourage people to come back, and new monthly or second bi-monthly content for people to come and play is a good way to do it, especially with the theme park MMOs, and that's essentially what drives the player base in a theme park MMO. I guess my final thought on Final Fantasy 14, if you're happy to move on to like our final thoughts on that sort of matter. Yeah?
Yeah.
All right. Is there's people who want to hop MMOs and stuff, or are not sure whether the subscription is going to be worth it. Feel like there's a lot of risk in a subscription-based model. Like it's inherently risky that you have to pay this amount of money each month. But as I said, you actually don't have to pay that unless you want to continue playing the game. There's no added risk with a subscription model. Essentially, you get 1 month free when you purchase the game. It's slightly more than a month's worth of subscription, but you get to try that game out for a month. Now, that's the exact same amount probably that you'd be paying for something like Guild Wars 2 that was going to continue to be free to play after that. If you buy Final Fantasy, let's say, and then play it for a month and then decide, that this is pretty good, I'm probably just going to give this a rest for a while, try some other games out. You come back in a few months' time, you see there's a bunch of new content come, then you can decide, okay, this has really got that value for me there for that subscription. It's really worth me the $12 or so for me to pay to come back to that game and play it then. But comparing that against another game like Guild Wars, for example, where it's free to play to come back to, sure, you don't have to pay to come back to that, but you still have that same where you can compare the value between those two games. Is this worth a subscription for me after I've already played it? So essentially, what I'm trying to say is there's no real risk in buying the game. You just have to pay that initial thing, which you'd be paying for any other sort of game. So I highly recommend to people that are unsure whether the Final Fantasy 14 will be worth the subscription is just to buy the first month, buy the game, and try it out for a month and see what you think.
Excellent,
What's
excellent
your
final
final
thoughts.
thoughts?
Well, I really like that you keep going back to Guild Wars 2 because, like, I praised it earlier and I will praise it again. It is a game that has, under all respects, pretty much done almost everything right in terms of attracting people, keeping them playing, and keeping them paying, essentially. And in terms of Final Fantasy 14, it's really hard to generate thoughts. I mean, it goes without saying with the content on my YouTube that I'm fairly biased to the Final Fantasy series and that I'm a huge fan. So my final thoughts, I feel like almost aren't that big of a factor because I'll always say I think it's worth it, I think it's worth it, I think it's worth it. But looking at it from an objective point of view, I understand why somebody wouldn't want to pay monthly. I mean, all the arguments are there. Not wanting to pay monthly, just that obligation. They're unsure of what kind of content they'll get because that was a big one with Star Wars. They paid monthly, got no content, and then it was essentially, it feels like wasted time almost because you know you're not going anywhere with it. But with Final Fantasy and with the care that Yoshi's taking into it, and just that just his explanation blew my mind, is really just part of my final thoughts. It makes me more confident in the subscription based model, and not just in Final Fantasy, but I think more MMOs should be trying it. Just MMOs that have their own money and don't feel that they're pressured by investors. I feel like we could see some better quality content out there coming more consistently because consistency is a big thing. I don't know how often Guild Wars 2 does their patches, but a lot of people say that it's just not often enough. And I feel like if Yoshi can keep his promises, Final Fantasy XIV will be okay as a subscription-based game. If he falls on his head and pulls what some people in the action RPG world might know as a Jay Wilson, then yeah, I knew you'd get that one. then Final Fantasy XIV will fall again, and it'll probably end up not generating enough subscriptions to really keep Yoshi's job, and they'll need to fall back to some other method. The game could close down altogether, could go free to play, but until 2.5 months have passed and we see if his first word was a good word, then my final thoughts in short are just try it out. As you said, it's essentially a $30 game that you're going to play for a month for no subscription anyway. So look at it as a half price game that you get to play for a month without paying anything extra.
Yep, that's it. Yeah, personally, like as you said, you've played a lot of Final Fantasy. That you're without question going to play this game and pay the subscription. You're used to paying a subscription. I'm not used to paying a subscription. Well, I can't even say that word. I've never actually paid a subscription for a game in the past, and yet I feel pretty comfortable and confident going into this, thinking that I'm going to pay a subscription for this game for 2, maybe 3 months. Give it a go. See how I feel. Then at that point, there's no real extra risk for me, and maybe that thought will resonate with some of you guys.
Yeah, perfect way of putting it. All right, well, that was all I really wanted to talk about. Do you have any questions for me that maybe are rattling your mind?
No, I think that's about it for now. I think that covers that topic pretty well. Hopefully help some people decide to either try the game out or stick with free-to-play games.
All right, guys. Well, then this was a podcast with ZiggyD. Just want to do my shout-outs real quick. Just want to say, if you like this video, please like, favorite, subscribe, and share, especially if you have people who are kind of maturely able to debate the whole subscription versus free-to-play thing, because we don't want to start a witch hunt over anybody. I also want to thank my subscribers for donating. I'm getting my new microphone tomorrow, so this thing, which luckily because Ziggy's talking to me doesn't die in the middle of my videos half the time, won't be a problem anymore. So if you like that. Also, I do charity events with Athene Live. He's a popular League of Legends, World of Warcraft player. He'll be taking direct donations starting this weekend, so I'm no longer going to be asking if you are interested in a subscription-based charity payment. And final words, if you don't feel like donating to charity or to better the quality and quantity of my stream, check out my Facebook at www.facebook.com/MrHappy1227. In my video, at least, I'll put the link in the description. I'll also put a link to Ziggy's because he's got some great content that you guys should check out as well. I'll also put a link to his website because that's been going really well over the past, what has it been, a week and a half, 2 weeks now since you put that website up?
Yeah,
I don't remember the exact date.
A while now, but
yeah, but I really like it, and I stopped by it.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, man. I'll try and put some more content out there soon. But yeah, pro shoutouts, man. Pro shoutouts. That was extremely well done. Thanks to you, Mr. Happy, for having me hosting the show this time around, hosting the podcast. That was pretty fun.
I don't know. You kind of saved it. You kind of saved it midway through when I just kept asking about Path of Exile. So I'll give you 75% of the credit.
Getting a bit distracted on the action RPG. Path of Exile is an excellent game. I'm more than happy to talk about that as evidenced by my channel. But anyway, yeah, you guys check out my website at ZiggyD.tv, and you can pretty much find links to everything there you need to know about me. And if you're already on my channel, then go check out Mr. Happy's channel and check out his Final Fantasy XIV content. He's got some pretty sweet guides on there now. Anyway, that's it for now.
All right, take care, guys. Till next time.